I didn't realize I was the problem, until someone agreed with me. Not argued. Not corrected. Just agreed. And somehow, that felt worse than being blamed. I used to think I was just unlucky. That's the simplest way to explain it. Things just didn't work out for me the way they seemed to for everyone else. At work, I was always overlooked. In relationships, I gave more than I got. Even small things, traffic, delays, missed chances, felt like they were always tilted slightly against me. I remember thinking, some people just have it easier. It didn't feel like complaining. It felt like observing reality. My days followed a pattern. Wake up, check my phone, scroll through people who seemed ahead of me somehow. Then work, where I did what I was supposed to do, but rarely got noticed for it. Conversations felt surface level. Opportunities passed me by. I'd go home tired, not physically, but mentally drained. And at night, I'd replay things. What someone said. What they didn't say. What I should have said. There was always this quiet sense that I was being treated unfairly. Not in a dramatic way. Just, consistently. I didn't call it a victim mindset. I just thought I was being realistic. It started to shift the day I met Daniel. He wasn't a close friend. Just someone new at work. Quiet, observant. The kind of person who listened more than he spoke. We ended up having lunch together one day, nothing planned, just happened to sit at the same table. I don't remember how the conversation started, but I do remember how easily I slipped into it. I told him about work. About how people got promoted for less effort. About how certain managers seemed to favor others. About how I'd tried, but nothing really changed. He nodded the whole time. Didn't interrupt. Didn't challenge anything. At one point, I said something like, "I guess some people just don't get the same chances." And he looked at me and said, calmly, "Yeah, sounds like you don't really have much control over your life." There was no sarcasm. No judgment. Just agreement. And for some reason, that sentence sat heavy in my chest. I laughed it off in the moment. Said something like, "I mean, not completely, but yeah, sometimes it feels like that." But the conversation stuck with me longer than I expected. Not because of what he said, but because of how it made me feel. Uncomfortable. I remember walking back to my desk thinking, wait, is that how I sound? Like someone with no control? That wasn't how I saw myself. I saw myself as someone trying, just not getting the same results. But over the next few days, I started noticing something. Not in others. In myself. I noticed how often I explained things in a certain way. If something went wrong, there was always a reason, usually external. The timing wasn't right. The person didn't understand me. The system was flawed. The opportunity wasn't fair. And the thing is, most of those explanations weren't wrong. That's what made it tricky. They were partially true. But they also kept me in the same place. I started replaying conversations in my head, not the way I usually did, focusing on what others said, but focusing on what I said. And there was a pattern. I was always reacting. Rarely choosing. A week later, I saw Daniel again in the break room. I don't know what made me say it, but I asked him. Do I really sound like I don't have control over my life? He didn't answer right away. He poured his coffee, leaned against the counter, and said, "You sound like someone who's very aware of what's happening, but not very aware of what you're doing about it." That hit differently. Because I didn't have a quick response for it. That night, I sat in my car longer than usual before going inside. I remember staring at the dashboard, thinking about all the situations I'd labeled as unfair. work, relationships, missed chances. And for the first time, I asked a slightly different question. Not, why does this keep happening to me? But, what role am I playing in this repeating? I didn't like the question. It felt uncomfortable. Almost accusatory. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next few days felt strange. Like I was watching myself from the outside. At work, when something didn't go my way, I caught the thought forming, of course this happened to me. But now, there was a pause after it. A small gap where another thought tried to come in. What are you going to do about it? Sometimes I ignored it. Sometimes I didn't know the answer. But the question itself changed something. One afternoon, a small situation made it clearer. A coworker got assigned to a project I had quietly hoped to be part of. Normally, I would have told myself, they always choose favorites. And I did think that. But then I noticed something else. I had never actually expressed interest in that project. I assumed they knew. I assumed they'd consider me. I assumed. And when it didn't happen, I felt overlooked. But was I overlooked, or just invisible by my own design? That realization wasn't dramatic. There was no big emotional reaction. Just a quiet, uncomfortable awareness. I had been waiting, a lot. Waiting to be noticed. Waiting to be understood. Waiting for things to feel fair. And in that waiting, I had convinced myself I was powerless. Not completely. Just enough to stay stuck. I started making small changes. Nothing extreme. Just different choices. I spoke up in meetings, even when it felt unnecessary. I asked questions instead of assuming answers. I expressed interest instead of expecting recognition. And the strange part? Not everything changed. Some things stayed the same. But I didn't feel the same. There was less resentment. Less mental replaying. Less of that quiet frustration that used to follow me home. Because even when things didn't go my way, there was a different kind of thought in the background. At least I showed up differently. And that mattered more than I expected. A few weeks later, I had lunch with Daniel again. I told him some of what I'd been noticing. The patterns. The assumptions. The small changes. He listened, the same way he always did. And then he said something that stuck with me. Most people don't realize this, but feeling like a victim can feel safer than taking responsibility. I asked him what he meant. He said, "If it's not your fault, you don't have to change anything. You just have to wait for things to change." That was it. That was the trap. It wasn't about blaming myself for everything. It wasn't about ignoring real problems or pretending everything was in my control. It was about noticing where I had quietly given up control, without realizing it. The mindset wasn't loud. It didn't say, "I'm a victim." It whispered, "There's nothing you can do." And I had been listening to that voice for a long time. The shift wasn't instant. There were days I slipped back into old patterns. Moments where I caught myself thinking the same familiar thoughts. But now, they didn't feel as convincing. Because I had seen something I couldn't unsee. I realized that perspective isn't just about how you see the world. It's about how you see your role in it. And for a long time, I saw myself as someone things happened to. Not someone who actively shaped what happened next. Nothing about my life became perfect. Work still had its frustrations. People still acted in ways I didn't understand. Things still didn't always go my way. But there was a quiet difference in how I experienced it all. Less like I was stuck inside a pattern. And more like I was part of the process. Now, when something goes wrong, I still notice the old thought sometimes. Why does this always happen to me? But it doesn't stay for long. Because there's another question that follows it now. A quieter one. A more uncomfortable one. But a more honest one too. What am I going to do about it? And maybe that's the real shift. Not from bad to good. Not from failure to success. But from waiting, to participating. From reacting, to choosing. Because the hardest thing to accept isn't that life is unfair. It's realizing how often we use that idea to avoid looking at ourselves. So now, I pay attention. Not just to what's happening around me, but to how I respond to it. Because that's the part one used to ignore. The part one used to give away without noticing. And sometimes I wonder, how many people are still living in that quiet space, where nothing feels fully in their control, but they've never stopped to ask why.